Welcome back, friends. This is the story I'm going to read today about Mrs. Toggle's zipper. And there's the Z word in it, zipper. This is a winter type story, and my goodness, it's not winter now, is it? The weather has warmed up so much already. Surprising. But this story is taking place in the winter. You guys aren't having to zip up jackets so much like we were doing before spring break, but we still had some instances where those zippers got stuck. That's what's happening in this story. We'll see. She's having a hard time getting hers unstuck. We managed every time, didn't we? Wasn't always easy, but we did it. Mrs. Toggle's zipper. Mrs. Toggle's a teacher. She's going into the classroom, and her children are coming inside also. When Mrs. Toggle's children arrived at school in the morning, they changed in the hall from their boots to their shoes. Where they live, it must be very cold and snowy or wet or something. When the bell rang, they picked up their boots and book bags and marched along to their room. They stuffed boots and bags into their cubby holes and hung up their coats. Then they sat down at their desks. "Good morning, Mrs. Toggle," the children said in their best morning voices. "Good morning, class," said Mrs. Toggle in an unusually grumpy voice today. Wonder what that would sound like. Good morning, children. Not so happy, right? Then the children noticed that Mrs. Toggle was still wearing her coat, the big, puffy, fuchsia-colored one that she got for Christmas. "Mrs. Toggle," yelled Joey, "you forgot to take off your coat." "I didn't forget," said Mrs. Toggle uncomfortably. "I can't take it off because the zipper is stuck. I'm afraid it's going to be a long, hot day." "How'd the zipper get stuck?" Nina asked. Mrs. Toggle fanned her face. "Oh, how does any zipper get stuck? First, a tiny bit of cloth gets caught in it, then you pull and keep pulling, and a little too hard, and before you know it, you're trapped in your coat like a hand in a cookie jar." I bet you never got your hand trapped in a cookie jar, did you? The children gathered around Mrs. Toggle's desk to see for themselves. Yep," said Joey. "That zipper sure is stuck." And the others nodded their heads. "What's worse," said Mrs. Toggle, "the thingamajig is gone." "The what?" said the children. "The thingamajig that you pull the zipper with, up and down. Mine is lost." I think maybe that's called a toggle. I think that's why this is called Mrs. Toggle's zipper. She's named for that, maybe. "Oh," grinned the children. They all thought happily about their own coats hanging on hooks with their zippers open and the thingamajig still on them. You know, the little handle that you hold on to pull the zipper up and down? She calls it a thingamajig. "Maybe we can help. It's worth a try," said Mrs. Toggle. Mrs. Toggle braced her feet on the floor. She leaned forward in her chair and held out her arms. Some children grabbed one sleeve, some the other sleeve. Paul and Nina grabbed fistfuls of collar. "Now," yelled Mrs. Toggle, and everybody pulled. And everybody landed with thuds and bumps in a heap on the floor. Mrs. Toggle's collar was as far up as her nose. But no further than that. Paul wanted to get busy learning the times tables. "Mrs. Toggle," he said, "let's go to the nurse's office. Maybe Mrs. Schott can help you." Is Mrs. Schott a good name for a nurse? So Mrs. Toggle and the children trudged down the office to Mrs. Schott, the school nurse. When Mrs. Schott saw Mrs. Toggle's hot red face, she reached for the thermometer and plopped it into Mrs. Toggle's mouth. Mrs. Szymanski doesn't have that kind of thermometer in our office, does she? In our health and records office, she has the kind that goes in the ear, right? Mrs. Toggle shook her head. Mrs. Schott. "Oh," she said, "don't talk with the thermometer in your mouth," said Mrs. Schott sternly. "I'll telephone your mother." "I'm not the mother," mumbled Mrs. Toggle. Mouth closed, ordered Mrs. Schott. She's trying to mumble with a thermometer in her mouth. Nina spoke up. She's not sick, and she doesn't live with her mother because she's a grown-up. Mrs. Toggle is hot because she can't get her coat off. The zipper's stuck, and the thingamajig is lost. Then we must pull it off, said Mrs. Schott. Oh, we tried that, Paul said. This time we'll add a bandage, the nurse answered. Bandages make boo-boos better. But first, Mrs. Toggle, you must take that thermometer out of your mouth. Mrs. Schott stuck a bandage on the zipper where the thingamajig was supposed to be. Then she pulled, and the children pulled, and they all ended up with thuds and bumps and bangs on the floor of Mrs. Schott's office. Mrs. Toggle's collar was up as far as her nose, but no further than that. Mrs. Schott shook her head. I must call the principal. He'll know what to do with you. The principal, Mr. Stickler, left important matters on his desk to hurry to the nurse's office. Mr. Stickler frowned when he saw Mrs. Toggle. Mrs. Toggle, it's against school rules to wear your coat all day. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Toggle, but I can't take my coat off. The zipper is stuck. Tell him about the thingamajig, said Nina. The what? Mr. Stickler asked. You know, said Paul, the what's it? The doodad, said Caroline. The whatchamacallit, said Joey. My students are right, said Mrs. Toggle. The thingamajig is missing from my zipper. The principal frowned again. Mrs. Toggle, he said, in my job I have learned that if you want to get out of a tight spot, you must follow the rules. Pay attention, children, he said. Make 2 straight lines. One line pull on the right arm, the other line pull on the left. Mrs. Schott, you be responsible for the collar. I shall pull on Mrs. Toggle's feet. We've tried that, said Joey. Pulling doesn't work, Nina agreed. Did you make straight lines? Asked Mr. Tockler. That's the rule. Stay in straight lines. Now get ready, get set, pull. Everybody's pulling. Mr. Stickler's holding her feet. One group of children is pulling one sleeve, one the other, and Mrs. Schott is holding her collar, pulling her collar. The children and Mrs. Schott pulled in one direction. Mr. Stickler pulled in the other direction. Mrs. Toggle tried to make herself small and wiggly, but with thunk, thuds, bumps, bangs, and a kaplop, they all ended up on the floor once more. And Mrs. Toggle's coat was as far as her nose, but no further. Mr. Stickler said, Enough of this. We don't want holes in the school floor just because of Mrs. Toggle's zipper. I'm calling the custodian. I'm afraid he'll have to cut this coat off. No, yelled the children, and Mrs. Toggle cried, Never. Remember, it's a brand new coat she just got for Christmas. The custodian, Mr. Abel, arrived wearing his big work apron. Tools bulged in every pocket. He looked at Mrs. Toggle in her coat. Is the building too cold for you? He asked kindly. Maybe the thermostat's off. I'll go check. Wait, said Mr. Stickler. See, said Caroline, Mrs. Toggle can't get her coat off because the zipper's stuck. Yes, the principal said, and there's a problem with the thingamajig. Mr. Abel listened carefully. He said, I can see that the pull tab is gone. Oh, that makes sense. It's called a pull tab. The what, said the children and Mrs. Toggle and the nurse and the principal all together. I said, the pull tab is gone. Don't worry, I've seen worse. Ooh, he sounds like he knows what he's talking about. Mr. Abel pulled a pair of needle-nose pliers out of one huge apron pocket. He used the pliers to loosen the grip of the zipper's metal teeth on the shiny fuchsia-colored lining of Mrs. Toggle's coat. Gently, with his large fingers, Mr. Abel eased the lining away from the teeth. Then he slid the zipper down, down, down. It opened completely. Mr. Abel helped Mrs. Toggle off with her coat. A happy smile spread over Mrs. Toggle's face. Mrs. Schott and Mr. Stigler and the children cheered. "You should get a new pull tab for that zipper before you zip it up again," said the custodian. "I surely will, Mr. Abel," said Mrs. Toggle. "I am forever grateful to you." The principal went back to important matters. Mrs. Schott rushed off to check a child for chicken pox. Mrs. Toggle and the children traipsed back to their room to tackle the times tables. Sounds like they might be in 3rd grade. Mr. Abel pulled a small pad from his huge apron pocket and wrote himself a reminder. Remember to look up thingamajig in the dictionary. You think thingamajig is in the dictionary? Is that a real word? Or did they just make it up? Maybe we should look it up and see. I don't know. Thank you.